to whole, complete, and perfect people. It's wonderful to have you. Michael, I'm sorry. It's so good to see you. I just told everybody to pray for you because you were sick. Oh, it worked. Yeah. Oh, it was wonderful to see you back. It chokes me up. Oh. Before I get started, does anyone have a program this morning with a paperclip on it? Yes. Irene. It happens that I've been speaking from Resilience from the Heart, and I thought I lost it on an airplane, but I didn't, so I ordered another copy. So you get to have it this morning. And that means that next week you get to do the talk. Always a catch, always a catch. Well, it's lovely to see you here this morning, those of you who managed to crawl out of bed this morning and get here on time. I was just wondering if maybe with the days being a bit cooler and a little bit darker in the morning, if people are feeling that. But anyway, we need to take a poll, I think. So most of you know that a couple of weeks ago I went to Toronto for 3 days to spend Thanksgiving with my family. With my daughter and my 2 granddaughters. And I was sitting talking to my granddaughter Sadie about Greg Braden's book because I'd been reading it on the plane. And this particular one is easier to read than his other books. They're not quite as scientific as the others. And I was really enjoying it. And I said to her, one of the things that has always puzzled me in metaphysics is when we hear that there is no such thing as time or space. Because I think, it takes me time to get up in the morning, it takes me time to get ready to go somewhere, it takes me time to get in my car, it takes me time to get to the center. I don't just wake up and I'm here, haven't yet learned to teleport. And all of a sudden, in the last few weeks, as I've been thinking on these things, the thought, of course, that came to me is that our thoughts and our feelings have no time or space. They're immediate. When we're thinking something, the thought is immediate. When we're feeling something, it is immediate. So Sadie and I were talking about that, and we were talking about how that energy goes out from us, and the energy from the heart, as Greg Braden says, it's been measured to be at least 40 times more powerful than the brain. And so whatever it is that we're feeling, if we're having good feelings, happy feelings, or sad or angry, whatever, that energy is going out a long way, and it's going out very quickly and very powerfully. And also we were talking about the intuitive nature of that. If this is going out from our hearts, then there are the unspoken things that are going on that other people are picking up as well. And and you've all experienced this. You know what it's like. You're thinking about somebody, and all of a sudden the phone rings, and you pick it up, and it's that person. Or even more exciting is when you're thinking about somebody, you think, I'm going to go and phone that person, and you pick up the phone, and there's no dial tone because the person's already on the line, because you've been dialing it at the same time. And I find more and more these days that I'll be sending somebody an email that I'm thinking of, and as soon as it goes out, there's their email back to me that we were writing it at the same time. So we were talking about these things, and I kind of looked at my watch and I said, I think maybe it'd be a good idea for us to go shopping for groceries for Thanksgiving. At which point my daughter came in and said, I think it's time for us to go shopping for groceries for Thanksgiving. And so off we went, and Kendall and I have always had that kind of intuitive connection. And we were going around the grocery store, and I was thinking, gosh, it'd be nice if we went to a movie tonight. And Kendall came around the other corner with the things on her list, and she said, why don't we go to a movie tonight? I was thinking it'd be nice to see A Star Is Born, and I said, I just had the same thought. That's the movie that I thought I'd like to see as well. And then, we got home, and I was thinking, I think I'd like some tea. And Kendall said, would you like some tea, Mum? And we're in that lovely, easy rhythm that you fall into with people that you love, and sometimes with perfect strangers as well. And so Sadie and I just kept laughing, because this is what we'd been talking about, the no time, no space, and you instantly pick things up. And Kendall and I, as I said, we've had that connection for years, and I remember years ago, in a previous incarnation, I was walking down the street in New York one day, and Kendall was at a ski camp in Mount Oregon. She was on the development team for the Canadian National Ski Team, and I saw her knee. It just popped in front of me, and I just had this awful feeling. And when I got back to my hotel, I phoned the camp and asked to speak to Kendall, and the receptionist said, "Oh, they're all out on the hill." And I said, "Will you please check?" And Kendall came to the phone, and she said, "I hurt my knee, Mum. I had a bad fall." And that kind of thing happened to us all the time. So when she was in South Africa as a journalist and was in a lot of danger every day, she used to phone me at 6 o'clock in the morning to wake me up, to tell me she was okay, so that I wouldn't get up in the morning and be having weird thoughts about what might be going on. So what's this got to do with anything? A lot of these thoughts that come to us, a lot of these feelings that come to us are really good feelings. We experience them all the time, and we experience these synchronicities. And it's called intuition. I mean, we all know that. Ernest Holmes says intuition is the voice of God that is coming and working through us, and basically working through our hearts. And it's something that we have to cultivate. It's something that we have to listen to. But even when we're cultivating it, even if we're thinking of somebody, or sometimes we have a premonition that we shouldn't do something. I really don't feel like going to that party tonight, or I shouldn't walk down that street, or whatever. If we do go and we're feeling that way, chances are pretty good that we're going to say afterward, "I knew I shouldn't have gone. Something told me that I shouldn't have gone." But do we really, really listen? And then there are the things that happen where we wonder why. And there's a story. Robert Redford was in his New York office putting together a film deal. And he was going to fly back to Los Angeles the next day. And the deal was put together much faster than he anticipated. And so he decided that he would see if there was an earlier flight and he could get out that day. And he did get out that day. There wasn't a problem. Well, it turned out that was September 10th. And if he had taken his flight on September 11th, he would have been on the plane that went down in Pennsylvania when the World Trade Centers were attacked, and when the Pentagon was attacked. There were 4 aircraft that went down that day, and his flight was actually booked on the one that went down in Pennsylvania. And he said he didn't have any intuitive hit about it. It wasn't like, I really need to get out of here today. I don't want to go tomorrow. It was a convenience. And so he said, there but for the grace of God, because he couldn't explain it otherwise, and he would have been gone. But what was really interesting when I did some research on this was I discovered that on those 4 flights, there were 387 people who canceled flights that day, or who didn't make it to the airport because they were stuck in traffic. That's an enormous number of people when you think about it. I mean, it's almost 100 people per flight. And how many times have you gone on a flight where all of a sudden there's nobody else on the plane but you, and because everybody canceled? And so there were things that happened to people. They were either delayed or they just had a feeling not to go that day. It works for us in so many ways. It's always working, and we're just not always aware that it is. And so how do we cultivate it? And as I look around these days, I think it must be harder and harder as I see people sitting at their tables in restaurants, and everybody's got an electronic device in their hands, and they're reading their emails, or they're texting, or whatever they're doing. A friend of mine was telling me a couple of days ago that she'd just visited her grandchildren in Ottawa. And she said each of them has their own beautiful room and their own beautiful house, and that they spend all their time when they're at home on their devices, and they bring them to the dinner table with them. And they're and this is becoming such a habit. And one of her grandson is actually in therapy because he's suffering from incredible depression. And I thought, I wonder if it's from lack of human contact. When our kids are becoming so addicted to electronic devices, and some adults as well, it's a shocking thing. And if we're used to being attached to them, it sometimes is hard to put them down. And some of my friends get exasperated with me because they call me on my cell phone and I don't even hear it because it's somewhere in my purse. And it's just not, I mean, if I'm on my own, I will check my emails and check texts and so on. But I just never think to pick up my cell phone, and very often have it turned off. So haven't yet got that addiction. I've got other things like Donald Trump to get out of my mind, but anyway, but not the cell phone. And so Greg Braden talks about the power of the heart and the resilience of the heart. We talk about having a broken heart when we lose a relationship, or when a loved one passes, or whatever. And for us, that feeling is real. There's that awful pain there, and that's our feeling nature. But as we heal, as we start to remember good times, as we start to remember happier things in our lives, then that healing starts to take place. We are resilient, but it is our hearts that make us resilient. It's not our minds. Our minds can make up all kinds of amazing stories about all kinds of things, and we start to believe them. Let's say somebody says something to me that might be hurtful, one line. I can go away and I can make up a whole story about why that person said that to me, what they were thinking about, that they never liked me, that they never loved me, that whatever. And it can grow into a real drama. The thing is, our minds can create the most amazing lies to ourselves, but our hearts never lie. And so it's really important for us to be able to get into that space, to be able to go to that loving place and to take the time to do it, and to be in the silence to do it, so that we can hear the truth. We can ask questions of our hearts, and they can respond. Our hearts have incredible memories. I may have talked about this before, but Greg Braden cites an incident in his book, which I had read about years ago in a book called The Heart's Code, which was written by Dr. Paul Purcell, and he quotes Dr. Purcell in it. And there was a 12-year-old girl who needed a heart transplant, and and she had the transplant, and she was really healthy afterward, but at night she had terrible, terrible nightmares. And the nightmare was always the same. She always had this dream that she was being attacked by a man. She was being raped and killed. And she'd be screaming in the night. Her mother would go in, and the dream was consistent. And they took her to a therapist, and the therapist wasn't able to help very much. And at some point, they decided to find the donor of the heart, or the family of the donor of the heart. And it turns out that the heart belonged to a young girl who was kidnapped and raped. And the interesting thing in all of this, which is such a tragic story, is that the little girl could describe the man who attacked her. Could describe him perfectly, could describe where it happened, when it happened, how it happened, and was able to then, with the help of police officers and an artist, to have a sketch of the man, and he was subsequently arrested and imprisoned. That came from the heart. It didn't come from the mind. That heart was in her. And what's been discovered is that people who have heart transplants, very often will have completely different taste in food. People who liked really bland food might like spicy food all of a sudden. People who are vegetarians are craving meat. And the same thing with music. Their taste in music will change. In some cases, it's a gender thing. Somebody who was, divinely feminine all of a sudden feels masculine, or vice versa. We don't hear about these things very often, but it is so interesting to think about when you think about the memory that is in our hearts. And when we are healing, when we're healing from grief or from some experience that has been unpleasant, to know that it's in that feeling nature that this happens. In Buddhism, the Buddhists believe that the heart is the center of its own universe, and that it has its own brain, its own feelings, its own emotions, its own intelligence. And in fact, it has been proven now that the heart has a brain of its own. It's called the small brain. This is the big brain, hopefully. The small brain is in the heart. But the small brain is the one that is really, really powerful. And that's the one that we need to cultivate. That's the one that we need to be working with all the time. And it's such an interesting concept because we're so busy with our lives these days. And Greg Braden says, what we really need to do is we need to quiet ourselves. And we really do. I mean, you hear this from me all the time, but we really do need to take this time, to go into that quiet place. And he says, start with your breath. And with your breath, allow it to become slower and slower and slower. And when it gets really slowed down, all of a sudden you notice that you're much more relaxed and you start to go into an altered state. It's not about saying, okay, 1, 2, 3, I'm going to meditate now. 1 breath, 2 breath. You gotta breathe until you feel yourself slow right down. And then focus on your heart. Absolutely focus on it. And as you're focusing on it, be aware that you start to feel where your heart is. You start to feel something about it. And then when you do that, to think of something you're grateful for. To remember a time when you truly, truly loved someone or something. Might have been when you picked up a new puppy. Could have been when you held your first child or held somebody else's baby. And the love that just poured out of you was so amazing that it would, you could hardly believe it. But he said, put yourself in that place where you have those feelings. That doesn't happen in 2 minutes. It doesn't happen in 3 minutes. It takes time to do that. And then, he said, once you're in that space, whatever the question is in your life, ask that question of your heart. Don't sit and try and figure it out with your brain. He said, again, it'll make stuff up. Ask the question of your heart. And how often is it, again, that we feel something that's like, don't want to go there, and then we're sorry that we did. We're getting that information. We're getting that divine guidance all the time. The question is, do we listen? And the question is, do we really want to listen? And when we really want to listen, and when we go through the process, then we hear it. Greg was talking about a time many years ago when he was taking a tour, a group of people, to Egypt. And they were going to go to the pyramids and tour Egypt and have a wonderful time. And it was right at the time that there was a lot of violence. There'd been a bus that had been hijacked and everybody had been killed. And people started getting pretty anxious about it. And his mother said to him, you really shouldn't do this. You should not go. This is a terrible time to go. There's so much violence there. And he said, well, I have to think about that. And so he talked to the various people who were booked, and they were pretty nervous as well. And he said, let us meditate on it for a few days and see what we get. And after a few days of going into his heart, after a few days of going into his heart, he really felt like everything was going to be okay. And so he phoned everyone. He said, the trip's on, we're going. And they went and they had an absolutely wonderful time. They didn't encounter any difficulties anywhere. And this kind of awakened an old memory in me, which I've possibly spoken about before, I'm not sure. But I was in Cairo many years ago on business. And before I left, everybody I spoke with said, oh, you're going to hate it. The air is like, it's so thick you can chew it. The smog is terrible. It's dangerous. You can't go anywhere alone. It's a horrible, horrible place. And I didn't think about it. I just thought, I always felt like I was safe wherever I went. And I arrived late at night, and it was very dark, and my taxi took me to the hotel. When I woke up in the morning, I put the curtains back and looked out, and there was the River Nile flowing below me, and in the distance I could see the outline of the pyramids. And my heart just expanded. I had tears running down my cheeks, and just felt this powerful love. And it was one of those things that there was no thought given to it. It was an experience. It was something speaking to my soul that really mattered a great deal to me at that time. And I thought, I've got to go out for a walk. I want to go out and see what's around here. So I went out, and I was walking alone. And a man, I mentioned this to a class a while ago, a man stopped me, and I thought he was going to ask for money. Excuse me. And he was dressed in the long white garb, I don't know what it's called, and had what I call the dish towel around his head with a band holding it in place. And he said, is this your first trip to Cairo? And I said, yes, it is. And he said, be happy here. Be safe. And I said, thank you. And I thought, what a nice thing. And I walked on, and a few minutes later, another man stopped me, and is this your first trip to Cairo? And I said, yes, it is. And he said, oh, be happy here, be safe here. And I said, thank you. And I walked on, and another man stopped me. Is this your first trip to Cairo? Well, by then I was totally in love with Cairo. And I said, it is my first trip to Cairo, and I love Cairo. And he said, and Cairo loves you. Be happy, be safe. And I kept on going, and I had an extraordinary trip. I mean, I met so many wonderful people, and I was taken to so many amazing places, and it was a deep spiritual experience. Although I was there on business, I had the opportunity to have spiritual experiences. And years later, it was only, I don't know, a couple of months ago, I think, I was thinking about this experience, and I thought, those men were warning me. They weren't just being friendly and stopping me in the street and saying hello. They were warning me. And when I was there, the hotel across the street, there were 4 American businessmen who were shot in a bar. And the military were then out surrounding the hotels. And when I went back to the hotel, they had their automatic weapons at the door. But I still never felt threatened in any way. And I thought, those people were warning me to be careful, a woman alone walking in the streets in Cairo. And it never even occurred to me, but the thing is, my heart was telling me that I was perfectly safe. And with these people who were stopping me and saying these things to me, I just thought, aren't they lovely? Isn't it lovely that people are so friendly here? It's just like walking down the street in a small town, even though there are a gazillion people all crammed around. Everybody's just so friendly. It never, ever occurred to me. And of course, when you're not feeling fear, you're not attracting things like that into your life. And I looked at that and I thought, that was a real heart experience. It was an extraordinary experience that I had, and so I could really relate to what Greg Braden was saying about that. So how much are we listening to our hearts? How much are we going to a place where if we're in some sort of trouble, if we're feeling sorrow, if we're anxious, whatever, how often do we go and just sit with it? Allow ourselves to be with it. Allow ourselves to feel it. Whatever it is, good, bad, or indifferent, go through the feeling. Go through the feeling and allow yourself to listen to what your heart is telling you, because it's going to tell you what to do. And when you make that decision, whatever it might be, you know that you've made the right decision. And you know that because you've been given that divine guidance, that there is more divine guidance on the way that's going to lead you on the next step along the path, whatever that may be. There's another story that Greg Braden, he didn't mention it in this book, but Dr. Purcell did in his, and I shared this with a class. And it's another transplant story. 2 doctors who worked in the same hospital, a husband and wife, and they were going on a holiday. And it was a road trip. And they were driving along, and they were having a terrible argument, and the car crashed. And the woman's husband was instantly killed, and she was not hurt at all. And she was in profound grief, of course. And she went back to work. And after a year back at work, she had donated her husband's organs. And after a year back at work, she said to one of her colleagues, I really want to know the person who got my husband's heart. And anyway, they were able to find that information. It turned out it was a young Mexican man. He was a teenager. And they got in touch with him and invited him to come to the hospital and to meet in the chapel with them. And his mother was coming with him. And they were to meet at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 2 o'clock came and the two doctors were there, but the young man hadn't appeared with his mother yet. And so the woman's colleague said to her, they're not coming, I think we should go. And she said, no, they're here. I felt my husband's heart come into the building. They're here. And a half hour later, they walked into the chapel, and the mother was so apologetic. She said, we couldn't find the chapel. It took us all this time. We were here on time, but we couldn't find the chapel. And so they sat down, and she talked to the young man. And after a while, she asked if she could put her head on his chest and listen to his heart. And he said that would be fine, so she did. And after a few minutes, she said, everything is copacetic. And she sat up, and the mother, her eyes were wide, the young man's eyes were wide. And the mother said, when my son came out of the anesthetic, he said, everything is copacetic. And she said, we didn't know what that meant. And she said, well, what it means is that everything is okay now. And I thought, what an amazing story that is. And the young man had changed his taste in food. He liked healthy food instead of, all of the food that he was used to eating, a lot of junk food. He all of a sudden had a great attraction to rhythm and blues and to jazz, which he'd never listened to before. He didn't want any of the music he'd heard before. He liked the music and the musicians that her husband had liked when he was alive. There were so many things that had shifted in him that were like her husband. And so we have this ability to heal. The heart will speak to us. The heart will speak to others. The question is, too, what is it that we want to have in our hearts? What feelings do we want to have in our hearts? Our hearts are resilient. Our hearts take us to amazing places. But let us replace anger and hatred and judgment and jealousy and whatever other emotions that are negative. Let us replace them with beautiful things, with love. Let us sit in that quiet. And let us be aware of our hearts. And let us ask the questions we need to ask. But let us feel the love and feel the gratitude and practice that. Because the more we practice that, the more the unhappiness goes away. That's really how we get to the most resilient place in our lives. And our hearts lead the way. And so it is.